Halloween has always been known as a holiday to go trick-or-treating and be afraid of ghosts and ghouls. For as long as I can remember, there has always been some kind of scare when it came to Halloween candy having poison in it, or even something like razors. There's even been memes that have come out stating that your neighbors wouldn't be giving out edibles to your children on Halloween night. However, on Halloween night in 1974, one little boy by the name of Timothy O'Brien would sadly die on the way to the hospital after ingesting a pixie stick that had cyanide in it. Why did this happen though? Was it someone he knew and loved? Today, we are going to talk about the murder of Timothy O'Brien and how his father was dubbed the Candyman and the man who killed Halloween because of one tragic Halloween night in 1974. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, my name is Monica. I like to post anti-MLMs, that's anti-multi-level marketing, and some true crime content here on this channel. So if any of that interests you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I would love for you to stick around. In today's video, I am bringing you the second installment of my Spooktober series for the year of 2021. I did this last year and I decided to do it again this year. So in today's video, I am going to be going over, if you didn't see the intro or the title, I will be going over the Candyman. And I did just want to say that, just as a disclaimer, this video is just for educational purposes only. All of my resources will be left in the description box below. I do recommend everyone doing their own research on this. I'm also going to issue a warning that there will be talk of violence towards children in today's video. Ronald Clark O'Brien and his wife Deneen lived in Deer Park, Texas, a suburb of Houston, with their son Timothy, who was born on April 5th, 1966, and their daughter Elizabeth, who was born in 1969. Ronald was an optician who worked at Texas State Optical in Houston. He was also the deacon at the Second Baptist Church, where he sang in the choir and was in charge of the bus program. Those who knew Ronald described him to be a model citizen, and one pastor even stated that Ronald was, quote, a good Christian man and an above-average father, end quote. However, Ronald had a hard time keeping a job. He worked for 21 different companies within a 10-year time span and had been fired a number of times for negligence or fraudulent behavior. It's been said that in the fall of 1974, Ronald was suspected of stealing money from his employer, who was Texas State Optical. With that being said, he was worried that he was on the verge of being fired yet again. His take-home salary was $150 a week, and that would be approximately about $830 today. For some, that might be sufficient and pay the bills, but for Ronald, it could barely put food on the table and pay for the roof over his family's head. Not to mention, he was more than $100,000 in debt. He had defaulted on some bank loans and his car was about to be repossessed. Although he was clearly going through some tough times financially, he had told some friends that he would be coming into some money soon that would help out a lot. Well, Halloween had come around, and this is supposed to be a fun holiday, one where children dress up as whoever they'd like to be and go trick-or-treating. We all know of the rich neighborhoods and how they're always the ones giving out the good candy, such as the big Snickers bar instead of the little ones. There have been so many scares of making sure children's candy wasn't laced with something or didn't have razors in it. I know when I was younger, my mom would actually check mine and my brother's candy to make sure none of them looked to have been opened or tampered with and that everything looked okay. Anything that did look suspicious went into the garbage. Then there's the one meme that I see circulate every single year on Facebook, and I will leave it up on the screen, but it says, officials, trick-or-treaters beware, marijuana candy edibles, and then someone responded with, absolutely no one on the planet will give away their edibles for free to your children, please grow up. And I see this meme every single year around Halloween time. But then there was Halloween night of 1974 in Pasadena, Texas. Ronald O'Brien had gone trick-or-treating with his two children, Timothy and Elizabeth, and their friends from church, Mark and Kimberly Bates, and their father, James Bates. Ronald and his family lived in a townhouse in Deer Park, while James Bates lived in what one article called a more fashionable neighborhood in Pasadena. In my mind, that means a rich neighborhood where they have the full-size candy bars. It was raining that night, so the two dads and their children only went trick-or-treating on two streets. These streets were Citation and Donnerville Drive. There was one house in particular that they went up to, which was 4112 Donnerville Drive, that was dark. What investigators would later find out is this house belonged to a man named Courtney Melvin. The children thought maybe the person was hiding inside because they weren't giving out candy, or they just weren't home at all. I usually turn my lights off during Halloween and leave a bowl out with a sign because I don't want people ringing the doorbell and upsetting my dogs. I always feel bad because I would love to see all the adorable little costumes, but my dogs would just run out of the house or bark their faces off, so it's just not worth it to me. Anyway, the kids were ringing their doorbell, but no one was coming out, so they decided to give up and go to the next house. Ronald stayed behind because for whatever reason, he was determined to get candy for those kids from that house. Just a few minutes later, Ronald had caught up with the rest of them and showed up with 5 pixie sticks. He said to James, quote, "You've got rich neighbors. Look what they're giving out," end quote. James would later say that he never saw the door to that house open. Once they all got back to James's home, at the end of their trick-or-treating, Ronald gave each of the children a pixie stick and joked that he would have the 5th one himself. However, some trick-or-treaters had come by the Bates family home, and Ronald had asked the kids who wanted the last pixie stick that he had. Whitney Parker had said he wanted it. He was an 11-year-old boy who lived a few blocks away, and he attended the same church, Second Baptist Church, that Ronald O'Brien was a deacon at. When they got home, Ronald told his son that he could have one candy before bed, and Timothy decided to choose the pixie stick. The weird part was that the pixie stick was stapled shut, but I guess Timothy didn't think anything of it, nor did his father. Timothy had a little trouble getting the sugary powder out of the tube, so his father helped him. As soon as Timothy tasted the sugary powder, he told his dad that it tasted really bitter, so Ronald gave him some of his Kool-Aid to wash it down with. All of a sudden, Timothy started complaining of not feeling well. Ronald would later tell police, quote, 30 seconds after I left Tim's room, I heard him cry to me, Daddy, Daddy, my stomach hurts. He was in the bathroom convulsing, vomiting, and gasping, and then suddenly he went limp," end quote. Ronald was trying to take care of little Timothy, and he called 911. 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien, who had his entire life ahead of him, died on the way to the hospital. Ronald would eventually go on to sing a solo at his church in memory of Timothy after the funeral, and he would say, quote, "He was all boy. He loved football, basketball, anything. He never met a stranger, but I have my peace in knowing Tim is in heaven now," end quote. Although something that was odd was he was mad at his relatives for not staying up the night of the funeral. Ronald was upset because he had written a song about Jesus and how Timothy was joining the Lord in heaven, and his family wouldn't watch a recording of the performance on TV since it was being broadcasted. According to former Harris County prosecutor Mike Hinton, he stated, quote, "It was just a coincidence that I was working the police intake that night. I got a call from the Pasadena Police Department. They told me an 8-year-old boy had died. He was rushed to the hospital, but he'd already passed," end quote. Bill Lanier, who was a Pasadena police sergeant, had also gotten a call about Timothy, and Bill said that when he went to the hospital, quote, "He was lying there foaming at the mouth," end quote. Because of the circumstances, Mike Hinton called Dr. Joseph A. Yahimchik, who was the chief medical examiner of nearby Harris County. Quote, "I told him the situation and he asked what the young man's breath smelled like," end quote. As soon as Mike told the doctor that after calling the morgue, they had smelled the scent of almonds coming from Timothy's mouth, that's when the doctor knew it was cyanide. If you watch my video about the Chicago Tylenol murders, I went over this topic very briefly in that video, but not everyone can smell the almond smell that comes from cyanide. Only some people have that capability. It has to do with your genetics and everything like that. But once the doctor knew about this, there was an autopsy done. It showed that Timothy had consumed enough potassium cyanide to kill 2 grown adults. As soon as investigators figured out it must have been the pixie sticks, they went to retrieve the other 4. A few people almost suffered the same fate that Timothy did. One of the children wanted to eat the pixie stick so bad, but he couldn't open it because it was stapled shut, so he fell asleep with it in his hand, while the other person was Deer Park EMT David Malone, who was going to give Timothy mouth-to-mouth. Doctors later told David that there was enough cyanide in Timothy's mouth that if it would have killed anyone who tried to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Later on, they would test the candy to find out that the top 2 inches of the sticks were packed with poison, potassium cyanide to be exact. Now that they knew that the pixie sticks had been laced with cyanide, they needed to retrace their steps that night. This shouldn't have been hard since Ronald and James, along with their children, only went to 2 streets that night because it had been raining. Ronald was not a suspect at first, even though he didn't really show too much emotion at the hospital when his son passed. But they didn't really think anything of it until things started to not really add up. But once they asked Ronald to retrace his steps from Halloween, he started giving them conflicting statements as to which house gave him the poison candy. Although at one point he remembered it was the one house that was dark and looked like no one was home. He recounted that someone had given him the pixie sticks, but he never saw what the person looked like, besides that it was a hairy arm that poked out of the front door. However, the man who lived at this house had an airtight alibi. That Halloween night, he was working as an air dispatcher at Hobby Airport, and he had more than a dozen witnesses who could back up the story. This man's wife and daughter were actually home that night, but they had turned the lights off because they ran out of candy earlier on in the night. Ronald started looking even more suspicious once investigators found out about his financial struggles. And also once an insurance agent called on November 4th talking about how Ronald had taken out life insurance policies on his children on October 3rd. Ronald called to cash out the policy at 9 a.m. the day after his son Timothy O'Brien had been murdered. Robert Bello Jr., the insurance agent, said that he unsuccessfully urged Ronald to buy more attractive policies with smaller death benefits that would have set up $25,000 cash funds for each child at age 23. Robert said that Ronald stated during their conversation that his wife would not sign off on those types of policies and that they kept it in Robert's office for convenience. Was this the money that he was going to come into by the end of the year that Ronald had told his friends earlier that fall? Ronald was supposed to receive $20,000 upon Timothy's death. Investigators did find a piece of adding machine tape where Ronald had written down the amount of each of his bills, and the total came out to be approximately the $20,000 that he was supposed to receive from the insurance money. In addition to all of this, Ronald had inquired with several chemical companies on where to buy cyanide, and when he asked how much would it take to kill a person, he asked that in a joking manner. Ronald had also asked one of his customers who was a chemist about cyanide and one of his teachers. Now, I've read that investigators found a pocket knife, while I've also read scissors in the O'Brien residence with the pixie stick residue on it, which they used as evidence to suggest Ronald was guilty of poisoning his own son. One witness went to police and told them that they worked for a chemical company in Houston. They told police that a man had come in to purchase cyanide, but left after he was told that the smallest amount he was allowed to buy was 5 pounds. This witness couldn't identify that this man was Ronald, but they did recall the customer wearing a smock, like a doctor, which is the uniform that Ronald had to wear at work as an optician. According to Harold Nassif, a former Pasadena detective sergeant, he said, quote, "Since it had been raining, Mr. O'Brien had a raincoat on. Unbeknownst to his friends who he was with, he had the pixie sticks shoved up the sleeves of his raincoat," end quote. Ronald maintained his innocence the whole time, even after he failed a polygraph test and was caught with contradicting statements. But Detective David Mulliken, who was the one who interrogated Ronald after Robert Bello, the insurance agent, called about the life insurance policy, the detective's first question was, "Mr. O'Brien, how much insurance did you have on Timothy, and how long was it in effect prior to his death?" Ronald was a little surprised by this question, so what did he do? He lied and said that there was a $10,000 policy that he had bought earlier on in the year, even though his wife objected to it. In another room, Detective Nassif questioned Ronald's wife, Deneen. He had asked her about the life insurance policy, and Deneen mentioned a $10,000 policy. The detective remembers Deneen's reaction when she first believed that her husband was guilty of murdering their son for life insurance money. The detective said, quote, "I told her that O'Brien recently had increased the insurance on the children to about $60,000. Timothy's share was $31,000. She said, 'Oh my God,' and broke down. We didn't even need to tell her at that point that we thought he had poisoned her son," end quote. Now, in that quote, the detective said 31,000, but I've been seeing conflicting information where some said 20,000, some said 30,000 on Timothy for when he passed and what Ronald got. So I'm kind of up in the air. It's either 20,000 or 30,000, or in this case, the detective said 31,000. But anyway, In addition to all of this, as I stated earlier, Ronald had asked people about cyanide, but friends and Texas State Optical customers were reporting to police that Ronald had asked how much cyanide was needed to kill a person. Along with that, his funeral director stated that Ronald asked for 6 death certificates on November 1st and stated his son died of potassium cyanide poisoning. On November 5th, 1974, he was arrested and charged with the murder of Timothy O'Brien. Ronald maintained his innocence for the rest of his life. He entered in a not guilty plea, and his defense was trying to blame this on an untraceable man who was poisoning children in their Halloween candy. However, friends, family, and coworkers all testified against Ronald. On June 3rd, 1975, it took under an hour for the jury to find Ronald guilty for 1 charge of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. It took them a little over an hour to decide that Ronald would be sentenced to execution by the electric chair. Ronald tried to appeal his conviction for nearly a decade, but it wasn't until March 31st, 1984, when every single possible way for him to survive had been exhausted. He was finally put to death for the murder of Timothy O'Brien, his son. At this point, though, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled the electric chair a cruel and unusual punishment, so he was executed by lethal injection. This was his statement prior to being executed. Quote, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs, yet doesn't mean our whole justice system is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all of you who have taken part in any way in my death. Also, to anyone I have offended in any way during my 39 years, I pray and ask for your forgiveness, just as I forgive anyone who offended me in any way. And I pray and ask God's forgiveness for all of us respectively as human beings. To my loved ones, I extend my undying love. To those close to me, know in your hearts I love you one and all. God bless all of you, and may God's best blessings be always yours." End quote. I find that to be pretty messed up if you ask me. The gaslighting in that statement is just so ridiculous. No one cares if you've been offended, and no one is asking for your forgiveness. You should be the only one that's really asking for forgiveness, and even so, I honestly wouldn't have forgiven you. Ronald O'Brien murdered his own child for insurance money. Outside the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, a crowd of around 300 people gathered once they'd heard that Ronald Clark O'Brien had finally been put to death, and they were all yelling "trick or treat" and throwing candy at the anti-death penalty protesters that were there. Clyde DeWitt, who is the former assistant district attorney in Houston who worked the case, said, quote, "I am not able to imagine a crime more reprehensible than someone killing his own child for money," end quote. Back in 2016, Mike Hinton was interviewed about this case again, and he talked about how he still doesn't observe Halloween. He's the one that keeps his porch light off and refuses to answer the door. This case really affected so many people and changed Halloween. In 2018, the owner of the home at the time, Elizabeth Bagwell, stated, quote, "Someone took it upon themselves to take away the trust and fun from a lot of parents and a lot of children," end quote. That is the case of the Candyman, or the man who killed Halloween, Ronald Clark O'Brien. And I find this case really sad because Timothy, or Tim as Ronald called him, was only 8 years old. He had his entire life ahead of him that he was never able to live out because of his own father, because his father was in debt and he was going to collect insurance money on his own child. So he was willing to murder his own child for insurance money. I find that to be wrong. In addition to that, because he was also charged with the 4 counts of attempted murder, in addition to that, what was he thinking giving those pixie sticks to all of those other children, including his own daughter as well? Thankfully, they didn't suffer the same fate that Timothy did, but what was he thinking? Giving this to all of these other children who, what if they also ate this pixie stick? He was okay with potentially murdering all of these children for one, for insurance money, and two, and I guess for him giving the pixie sticks to the other children, it was to kind of get, I mean, I guess so that he didn't look suspicious. So it would be that his kids and these other kids got the pixie sticks. So it has to be from this one house, how he was trying to say that this man with this hairy arm came out and just gave him the pixie sticks, that it wasn't anything. But along with that, as a parent, my question would be, I mean, maybe it's because people trusted their neighbors and they just trusted people more back in the day than they do in modern times. Because, I mean, like I said in the beginning, my mom checked my candy and my brother's candy before. We weren't allowed to eat our candy until she checked it and made sure that it wasn't tampered with. So maybe it's just a different time. Maybe it's just that I grew up differently. But if you were to see that you got pixie sticks and it was stapled shut, it wasn't closed like it normally would be, I mean, wouldn't you think that was a little suspicious? But I mean, at the same time, like I just said, maybe it's because people were more trusting back then. So that's the only thing I could think of, because I feel like in today's world, we know more because of situations like this, because of cases like this, because of tragedies like this, because this is a tragedy. Timothy O'Brien could have lived his life and done so much with his life, but his father decided to end it for $20,000 or $30,000, because like I said, I've seen statements that say $20,000, others say $30,000. So for $20,000 or $30,000, his father ended his son's life. He murdered his son by poisoning him, and he watched him die. That to me, I'm at a loss for words really with this case, because this is really sad. It shouldn't have happened, and it's sad to me. So you guys let me know what you think of this case. Have you heard of it before? I feel like a lot of people have covered this case because it is pretty well known. So I feel like most of you have probably heard of this case by now. I had heard of it, but I didn't know the details of it. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. And if you have any other things you want to add about the case, feel free to leave them in the comment section below as well. The next Spooktober installment should be coming to you guys next week. And that one is going to be, which one am I covering next week? Oh, that one's going to be about another haunted doll. If you guys remember from last year, I covered the real Annabelle, which the real Annabelle is a Raggedy Ann doll. I figured since I talked about one last year, there's another one I wanted to cover, so we're going to cover it this year. But anyway, if you have watched up to here, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. This is Monica, reporting to you live from a highway. Bye!